During the 1980s, the Reagan administration is responsible for roughly 200,000 people slaughtered. And that doesn't mean just killed. You know, that means tortured and mutilated and raped. I mean, Pol Pot-style torture. That's pretty serious business. Hundreds of thousands, in fact millions of refugees, large areas of the country destroyed. All of this in an effort to block social reform. The Republicans attacked Dukakis as a card-carrying member of the ACLU. That's a very interesting phrase. That means card-carrying, of course, means really communist. You know, that's what it's supposed to imply. So here's an organization that's committed to defense of the Constitution, and according to the Republicans, that's communist. Well, you know, I think that characterizes modern conservatism. It's really a profoundly reactionary movement which is deeply opposed to the values on which the country was established. I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about.
Noam Chomsky concludes his two-part series, Analyzing the Mass Media and American Society, right now on Alternative Views. This will be the concluding section of our two-part series featuring Dr. Noam Chomsky from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of America's foremost critics of the mass media and American society. Noam Chomsky is co-author of a very good book on the mass media called Manufacturing Consent. In this program, he will mainly take questions from the audience. We also will present some information from the Progressive magazine on mass media distortions. And now here is Noam Chomsky speaking from Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
In political discourse, every term has two meanings. You've got to start by recognizing that. So democracy has an official meaning, which is something like, you know, the ability of the public to take part in running their own affairs or something. But it also has a technical meaning, the one that's actually used. Something is a democracy if it's run by the business classes. If business runs it, especially business elements that are supportive of U.S. interests, then it's a democracy. If not, it's not a democracy. It doesn't matter. Nothing else matters virtually. You'll notice that this criterion works quite perfectly for identifying democracies. Same is true of the term peace process. It has a dictionary meaning. In the dictionary meaning, a peace process is some kind of process that's trying to lead towards peace. But it also has a technical meaning. The technical meaning, in its technical meaning, it refers to whatever the United States happens to be advocating at a particular moment. Whatever diplomatic initiatives the United States is advocating, that's the peace process. Notice it follows that it's a logical impossibility for the United States to be opposed to the peace process. That's a nice consequence. To prove that the United States is for peace, you don't have to do any laborious inquiry into the annoying facts, because it's true by definition. Since the peace process is whatever the United States is up to, the United States is always supporting peace. And the U.S. enemies are always opposed to peace, because they're not supporting what the U.S. is up to, and by definition that means they're opposed to peace. You'll never find in the U.S. media, or for that matter in U.S. scholarship, for the most part, any such phrase as the United States is opposing the peace process, or the United States is trying to block the peace process. You can't find such statements because they'd be logical contradictions. Actually, I made this statement in a talk in Seattle a couple of months ago, and there is a media analysis group in the graduate school there, and a couple of weeks later I got a letter from somebody saying he was kind of intrigued, so he did a database study of the New York Times over 10 years, and he found, I don't know, like 900 references to peace process and checked them all out. And in fact, there's not one case where the United States was opposed to the peace process. It's pretty remarkable because that was a period when the United States was trying to undermine diplomatic negotiations and settlement in Central America and in the Middle East and so on. Notice it's pretty remarkable. Even the most sublime state, you'd expect that it wouldn't always be in favor of the peace process, maybe just by error or misunderstanding. But in the case of the United States, it's 100, I suspect it's 100%. You might check and see if you can find any exception. And the reason is it's just true by definition, since the peace process is whatever we do. Now, there are two major examples of peace processes in process now. One of them's in the Middle East and one's in Central America. There's no time to go through the details, but if you look, you'll notice that in the Middle East, the United States has been trying to block a diplomatic settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict for the past 20 years, and it's still trying to block it. And in this, it's virtually isolated in world opinion. That's exactly what's going on now. If you like, I'll give you some details. I have a detailed discussion of it in the current issue of Z magazine, if you're interested. But I think it's quite clear. Nevertheless, the discussion is the United States is trying to advance the peace process. There's another peace process going on in Central America, which is no less interesting. I'll read you from the front page of the New York Times today. The lead story in the New York Times today, which I picked up on the airplane, says, U.S. envoy urges Hondurans to let the Contras stay. Okay, let them stay in Honduras. They're trying to kick them out. And then comes a long story, and you turn to the second page, the continuation page, and it says, on its face, the administration proposal to keep the Contras in place would seem to be inconsistent with the spirit of the regional peace agreement, which calls for their relocation. But administration officials say there's no inconsistency. Well, that's about as close as you can come. You know, on its face, it seems to be inconsistent with the spirit of the peace agreement. Well, the peace agreement is quite explicit. The 1987 peace agreement, which the United States has succeeded in undermining and destroying, says explicitly that the one indispensable element in obtaining peace in the region is the end of any form of support, logistical, military, propagandistic, etc., for irregular forces like the Contras. Now, it doesn't seem to be inconsistent with the spirit, but it's flatly inconsistent with the words to keep the Contras in place. Well, the same is true of everything else about that. That was the 1987 peace agreement, which the United States tried to undermine and did undermine with the support of the media. But there are others. There's right now there's a debate going on so-called humanitarian aid to the Contras. Well, the term humanitarian aid has a meaning. In fact, the World Court in its decision defines humanitarian aid. You look up paragraph 243 of the World Court decision, and it defines humanitarian aid as aid given for the hallowed purposes of the Red Cross, namely to relieve human suffering, and crucially it says aid that is given without discrimination to civilians on all sides of any conflict. Only under such conditions does anything qualify as humanitarian aid. Well, that means all the stuff given is called humanitarian aid has nothing to do with humanitarian aid. It's military aid. But you'll never find this discussed in the media. I doubt if you can find one reference to this in the media. So now we're talking about humanitarian aid that's going to be voted, the Bush administration hopes, to keep the Contras in place in violation of the 1987 agreement. Well, there was also a Central American President's agreement just last month, and that said something too. It said the Contras have to be relocated away from Honduras. So this is flatly inconsistent with that, not the spirit, but the wording. Furthermore, there was a ceasefire agreement between Nicaragua and the Contras last March over the deep objections of the United States last March 23rd. And that ceasefire agreement has some very specific terms in it. It says that aid can continue to go to the Contras in ceasefire zones, all of which are in Nicaragua, when provided by a neutral agency. That's what the wording of the agreement says. Congress passed legislation right after that to send what they call humanitarian aid to the Contras. But if you look at the legislation, it says specifically that it must be in accord with the ceasefire agreement, and it must be in accord with the Central American Peace Agreement. Well, that means that the only aid that Congress could legally send to the Contras in accordance with its own legislation is aid given by a neutral agency, like the Red Cross, to Contras in ceasefire zones inside Nicaragua. That's not just my interpretation. The ceasefire agreement also specified an international official in charge of monitoring the agreement. It's the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. He wrote a letter to Secretary of State George Shultz stating that the aid that the United States was sending was inconsistent with the ceasefire agreement, and he wanted to call the attention of the Secretary of State to this serious violation of the ceasefire agreement and the congressional legislation. That was never reported. Congress proceeded to send the aid. The neutral agency that they selected was USAID, State Department subsidiary. That's the neutral agency, and they're sending it illegally to Honduras. In fact, the aid that they're sending is not only flatly inconsistent with the Central American Peace Agreement, it's even inconsistent with Congress's own legislation. That's pretty tricky. You'll never find one word of discussion about this. This is against the background of years of the United States trying to undermine every effort at political settlement of those conflicts, whether they were through the Contadora group of Latin American democracies, or the United Nations, or the Security Council, where the United States vetoed resolutions calling on all states to support international law, and so on. And it continues. But nevertheless, according to the media, the press, the United States government is supporting the peace process. Well, I'm suggesting that wherever you look, if you look closely, you'll find exactly the same thing. You'll find quite a remarkable degree of civility and subordination to established power, particularly remarkable because there's no force behind there's no authority that can impose force. This is willing subservience, not compelled subservience, and the kind that in fact flows, I think, just from the logic of the institutions for the reasons that I mentioned. Well, let me return finally to a prediction of the propaganda model that I mentioned already, namely that however well confirmed it is, it cannot be part of the discussion. It's got to remain outside the spectrum of debate in respectable circles, maybe with some very marginal exceptions. The reasons are the ones I mentioned. They're pretty obvious. That conclusion, again, is quite well established empirically, and I think we may assume with fair degree of confidence that that will continue to be the case.
Noam Chomsky will take questions from the audience later. But right now, here is some information from the Progressive magazine featuring a study by Martin Lee and Norman Solomon from the organization Fairness and Accuracy in Media. And it's about the categories of distortion from information from the establishment media.
One category is loaded language. For instance, one person, one group that might be struggling for civil rights will be just engaged in civil disobedience, and the other end will be labeled as terrorists. Another example is the New York Times said that Moscow was going to violate the U.S.-Soviet treaty. But when it came to the Americans violating the ABM treaty, they only said that the Reagan administration was going to reinterpret the treaty. Also, they used left wing and right wing very interestingly and with a great deal of distortion. New York Times correspondents, for instance, said about the municipal elections in Berlin, both the extreme left and the extreme right have gained in this election. Okay, who was the extreme right? Well, it was the Republican Citizen Party, which was very racist and very, very right-wing. But who was the left-wing party that he was concerned about? The Greens, the little Greens, you know, the ecology, pro-peace people. And so this is the way the New York Times distorts things. You know, Suharto is moderate, and the Greens are leftist.
And only a few of the nuttiest reactionaries are right-wing, whereas one could argue that George Bush is right-wing, that NBC is right-wing, and GE And most of the corporations are advocating policies that in an earlier age would be seen as right-wing, to the right of any moderate center that you can possibly imagine.
Well, whoever is in power always usually designates themselves at the center, and anything to the either side of it are badasses. Well, there's another distortion. Of course, they throw around the word communist all the time. For people, they don't want communist or leftist or Marxist, even calling the Sandinistas communist in the New York Times and the networks all the time, although they were so far from it. It was incredible. But they also talk about the budding democracy in El Salvador, that lovely land of death squads. I always took me to death in the Vietnam War. They say, well, 50 communist troops were killed and injured today. You never hear them talk about how many capitalist troops were killed or injured. Always the communists.
How many counter-revolutionary, interventionist, imperialist forces were shot.
Another category of distortion in this article in The Progressive is unattributed assertions and suspicious sources. There, for instance, Dan Rather had an article in which he said, Bert Quint reports that the Palestine Liberation Organization conference in Algiers was orchestrated by Moscow. Well, where did he get that information? Nobody said. When they tried to nail down Dan Rather on it, CBS said, well, that might have been a strong word, orchestrated by Moscow. Might have been ill-chosen. Well, 150 million people or how many ever saw it, and they didn't make a retraction.
In point of fact, the networks are constantly conduits for disinformation. It's not just the CIA that plants stories like Gaddafi was going to assassinate Reagan, remember that one? But the administration are constantly feeding lies into the media that then the media broadcast, again, using as cover of unattributed sources. I found out in the research I'm doing on this book on U.S. television that John McWethy, who's the ABC Defense and Pentagon reporter, has been a constant source of disinformation for years during the Reagan administration.
There are so many leaks from the government, so-called leaks. So many of them you consider plants because it's just disinformation which the government wants to get into the regular media. Or they'll say, well, U.S. intelligence experts believe, or CIA people think, but they don't say who it is, and so you can know exactly who's pumping out this disinformation. Let's return to Noam Chomsky as he takes questions from the audience. The first one was about his opinion of PBS and the ACLU.
The ACLU is an important organization. The ACLU, in fact, became the ACLU right at the time of the Red Scare, Wilson's Red Scare, and in response to that severe repression. And since then, it has a pretty admirable record of it's a conservative It's a conservative organization, very conservative. The term conservative is another one of those that's been distorted out of any relation to its meaning. But in the real sense of the term conservative, the ACLU is a conservative organization which is trying to preserve basically conservative values, 18th century values, and it does a pretty good job on it. It's had bad periods. It went along with McCarthyism, for example. And it doesn't take the really hard cases. Those are taken by more militant civil rights organizations. But it has done very good things. It's a very striking fact that about the political system. You recall what happened with the ACLU in the last elections. The Republicans attacked Dukakis as a card-carrying member of the ACLU. That's a very interesting phrase. That means card-carrying, of course, means really communist. You know, that's what it's supposed to imply. So here's an organization that's committed to defense of the Constitution, and according to the Republicans, that's communist. Well, you know, I think that characterizes modern conservatism. It's really a profoundly reactionary movement which is deeply opposed to the values on which the country was established. And that's why they would call an organization calling for the defense of the Constitution a subversive organization. Now, what was the Democrats' defense against this charge that Dukakis supported the Constitution? His defense was to deny that he supported it. I mean, he didn't say, yeah, of course I'm a member of the ACLU and proud of it. What he said is they published a list of cases of the ACLUs that he disagreed with. That was the Democratic response. Well, that tells you something about elite opinion. No, I don't think the ACLU is an illusion. I think it's an important organization. I'm proud to be a card-carrying member and to speak at their meetings and stuff. I also think there are more courageous organizations that take harder cases. What was the second question? Oh, yeah, public broadcasting. Well, public broadcasting is an interesting case. In a lot of countries, public broadcasting I mean, how free public broadcasting is. Public broadcasting is not subject, as much at least, to business and to corporate and advertiser pressures. However, of course, it's subject to state pressures. How free and independent public broadcasting is depends typically on how free the state is. Now, like in a free society, public broadcasting will be free. For many years, the BBC was very independent. With Thatcher, another anti-democratic reactionary, the BBC has become much more constrained because the British government is also imposing harsh constraints on freedom of expression under Thatcher, another mislabeled conservative. But turning to the United States, public broadcasting is very weak as compared with virtually any other country, any other democratic country. You know, you look at the industrial democratic societies, they all have public broadcasting. Some of them have only public broadcasting. For example, in Israel, there's only a state TV. In England, until recently, there was only state TV, and now there's another channel, two other channels. I think in Canada, till recently, there was only CBC. There may be another one now, I've forgotten. But it's common. I mean, those are major channels, and that's true of most countries. And how free they are depends on how free the country is. In the United States, they're very weak because here things are run by corporations. This is a business-run society, and things are supposed to be under corporate control. So public broadcasting is very limited, and in fact, it survives to a large extent on corporate donations, which is a constraint. Gulf and Western, in one famous case, forced WNET TV in New York to cancel a program on hunger simply by saying they'd remove their subvention, and they had to submit. And public broadcasting is you know, it varies across the country. In the major centers like Boston and Washington and New York, it's very, very narrow. In fact, I think it's more tightly censored than corporate radio and television. In other parts of the country, like, you know, Laramie, Wyoming, and Des Moines, Iowa, and maybe here, it's more free. And that makes sense. The same is true of the commercial media. Because in the ideological centers, it's much more important to control what people think. What they think out in the sticks doesn't matter so much because there isn't much they can do about it. And as a result, it's more open. I mean, I can see that myself. If I go to Laramie, I get interviewed on public television, but that's virtually inconceivable in Boston. You know, maybe a minute now and then or something, in the interests of, you know, fairness or something. But and the reason is that, you know, the main centers, like say Boston, are subject to what's called a liberal bias, meaning tightly controlled by ideological managers who know their business and don't let things get out of hand. I think it's possible to put the kind of pressures on public broadcasting that can't be done on corporate media, but to that requires organization and real participation. There are other forms, I should say. Some of the most interesting and important things are listener-supported radio. Now, that's usually a small-scale operation, you know, fly-by-night operation, but they're very important. Now, that's really out of corporate control or state control. And you can tell, you travel around, as I do, to communities, and the ones that have listener-supported radio are quite different. There's just an independent culture that can sustain itself there with people participating and, you know, involvement of the community. I mean, it's just much more democratic, and you can see the results. But that's, you know, very limited resources, because resources lie essentially in the business community.
Another way they distort it is when they'll have a government source that has credibility, right? The Secretary of State or somebody like that. But then when they have non-government sources or critics, they'll have somebody from a foreign government. They'll have a Russian, or they'll have Ortega from Nicaragua. But they don't show the people in the United States who are progressive critics of the U.S. government. They always make it look like it's those dirty foreigners against the good old stars and stripes. So this is one way of showing. For instance, and when they do have a point-counterpoint, they got to the absurd stage where in the McNeil-Lehrer program they had a thing on nuclear weapons issues. And who was the dove they had? It was old Sam Nunn, giving the dovish point of view.
In fact, Frank, FAIR, that same group that puts out this analysis that you're reading, has recently published a report on the McNeil-Lehrer show where over a 9-month period they documented who the spokespeople were from the different groups of the society on the program. And they documented that it's almost primarily conservative groups and spokespeople. It's corporate spokespeople. It's these conservative think tanks that dominate the special guest and expert segments. And there's almost no labor union people, environmentalists, public interest group people, and no one left of center is ever on there. Supposedly, I think it was Lehrer, Jim Lehrer, said he doesn't like moaners and whiners from the left. And so he gave his producers instructions not to bring any of those types on the program. And they did a case study, for instance, of the Exxon Valdez story that during the period they were monitoring the McNeil-Lehrer program was one of the big stories. And they didn't have one environmentalist on, despite many special segments on the show. They would tend to have the governor of Alaska or an Exxon Corporation spokesperson or a congressperson, but they never had environmentalists on who you would think would be the experts that could really assess the impact of the oil spill on the environment. Likewise, when they have a segment on Central America, they rarely have people from, say, Nicaragua or the El Salvador left. They always have these right-wing conservative types here in the U.S. who are pontificating about Central America, and so you get a very narrow spectrum of opinion on our public television program.
The first cousin category to what we're talking about in this progressive article category is stenography or journalism. I thought it was very interesting that there was an article in the Daily Texan where a woman who was a journalism major, she was complaining because she said that a journalism professor told her that her job is mainly to be a quotation gatherer. Well, that's apparently what the news media like, because they come up there and they take down word for word all the things that these government officials have to say. Even when they're lies, they don't check them out to see if they're lies. Their statements are not corroborated. They just quote them and put them before you on the evening news in their little sound bites, but they don't balance this by getting some of these other people on that we've been talking about, some of the other progressives or critics from the American left or progressive point of view. Another category is Kissinger-Haig disease. It seems that David Brinkley and Meet the Press, Face the Nation, Hot and Nightline, they seem to have those two Martians, we call them. Anyway, they love the military and all the bloodshed that they can cause, but they have Kissinger and Haig on time and time and time again. Of course, they don't tell you that Kissinger has his own business, which is involved in a lot of these activities which they're talking about on the evening news.
In fact, Frank, we've given the report that Mother Jones has about what institutes, what think tanks in Washington provide the guest experts for either Ted Koppel and the public affairs discussion shows or the PBS shows. And it's almost always the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, or other of these right-wing organizations and think tanks. Occasionally you'll get the Brookings Institute, which is a very moderate centrist think tank, giving some of its experts on these programs, but you never have the Institute for Policy Studies or any of Nader's think tanks or any of the left progressive organizations giving their spokespeople, most of whom have academic credentials, who have written books, who have PhDs, who are college professors, whereas most of the people that are the soundbite experts from the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation have very minimal academic credentials. Many of them don't have PhDs, many of them have not published major books, but they're taken as the expert because they know how to produce the soundbite, the 20-second blurb that the networks are looking for, plus they're safe.
If you were the leader of the country on issues such as Central America and Israel, and you were the one that was making the decisions, how would you deal with the problem in the Middle East now?
If I were the leader of the country, I probably wouldn't do anything very much different from anyone else, no matter what I believed. And the reason is I would be under such tight constraints from real objective power that I just wouldn't have any leeway. There's good reasons for it. But so let me, instead of going into that, I go into that if you like, but instead of doing that, let me answer your first question. Let me take your other way of formulating it. What do I think we ought to do? Well, I think there are some pretty obvious answers, both in the Middle East and in, at least there's a general framework for obvious answers in the Middle East and in Central America. In the Middle East, there's been a very broad international consensus on a political settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and there has been for many, many years. That consensus, for example, was expressed in a resolution that came to the UN Security Council in January 1976, so that's 13 years ago. It called for a two-state settlement, establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, a settlement on the internationally recognized borders, namely the pre-June 1967 borders, and then it just repeated the wording of UN 242, the main UN document, with guarantees for the independence and territorial integrity and security of every state in the region and its right to live in peace and security within recognized boundaries. And then it went on to discuss some modalities, for achieving this end. That's the basic framework of the international consensus. Well, that particular resolution was vetoed by the United States. Israel refused to attend the session. The resolution was initiated by the three major Arab states, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, the three confrontation states. It was supported by the PLO. In fact, it was openly supported by the PLO. According to the Israeli delegate, who's now the president of Israel, it was in fact prepared by the PLO. Notice that that is worth noting this because that means that already 13 years ago, Arafat had gone exactly as far as he did in that famous press conference on December 14th, which was alleged by the media to have changed everything. Nothing changed. He just repeated the same position he'd been saying for the last 13 years. There's reasons why the United States changed its position, but that's different. It was supported by the Soviet Union. It was supported by most of Europe. It was supported by most of the non-aligned countries, in fact, virtually by the entire world. That's why the United States had to veto it alone. Well, you could argue about details, but something like that is probably the only plausible, at least interim settlement. If you wanted to pursue it seriously, you'd have to talk about economic relations of a federal nature between the two states and all sorts of other things, and modalities to secure it and so on and so forth. But that general idea has been a very broad international consensus. For years, the United States is alone, virtually, aside from Israel, in opposing it. I mean, not totally alone, like it's opposed by Gaddafi. There are rejectionists, aside from the United States. There's marginal groups around the world, like Khomeini, the Afghan rebels. I mean, there's a few other groups that oppose it. But primarily, it's opposed by the United States. That's why it doesn't get anywhere. Now, that has disappeared from history on the assumptions of the propaganda model. That's not part of the peace process. Why? Because the United States was opposed to it. And it's a logical impossibility that the United States should be opposed to the peace process. So therefore, that's gone from history. When the New York Times, or any scholarly monograph for that matter, reviews the peace process, they don't include this, because this is not part of the peace process. Well, that's only one example. There are many others. And I think that's a general framework for settlement. As far as Central America is concerned, I think it's pretty obvious what ought to happen, generally speaking. I mean, the United States has carried out major crimes in Central America, really major crimes. First of all, our whole history. Look, Central America is one of the most miserable areas of the world, and it's an area where U.S. influence has been enormous for a century. Well, at once that tells you something, I mean, you don't have to think very hard to figure out what that means. And it's for reasons. There are reasons for it. You look into the details, you can find out reasons for it. Even the so-called constructive programs were actually lethal, like take the Alliance for Progress. You know, most of a lot of what happened in Central America is just because we imposed dictators and gangsters and terrorists and so on if they ever try to get independent, as in Guatemala. But every once in a while there's something called a constructive program. The Alliance for Progress is the famous case. Well, you know, the Alliance for Progress was like a plague, probably the worst plague that hit Central America until the Reagan administration. That's killers in a category by themselves. The Alliance for Progress, first of all, was a completely cynical operation. I mean, the Alliance for Progress was not instituted by the Kennedy administration because they suddenly discovered that there are poor people in Central America. And they knew that all along. It was initiated because they were afraid that the poor people in Central America were going to follow the Cuban model. Now that means it began as a purely cynical operation, okay, and that showed. The Alliance for Progress was designed to impose on Latin America altogether, in fact, an agro-export model. They're supposed to shift production from subsistence crops to export for the benefit of U.S. agribusiness in the American market. Well, that has consequences. For example, it means that farmers in Central America are expected not to produce rice and beans for them, people locally to eat, but asparagus and broccoli and flowers for yuppie markets in the United States. Well, for one thing, that means they're not going to have anything to eat, so they got to import food, which they import from us at high costs, which is good for American agriculture. Subsidized usually by the American taxpayer, now subsidized by them. And it also means that, and that food is not going to be equally distributed. It's going to be distributed to the rich. Furthermore, the production is going to be by the rich because it takes capital inputs to produce the fancy fruits for the American market. So there's going to be landless peasants. Furthermore, they're going to produce beef. In fact, every Central American country, beef production moved up rapidly under the Alliance for Progress, while beef consumption reduced. And the reason is that ranchers moved in, often with North American connections, drove peasants off their land, turned it into grazing lands so they could send beef to North American markets for hamburgers. Great for terrific for American agribusiness and for pesticide and fertilizer manufacturers and for the rich in Central America, but not very good for the people. Now, you take a look at, go to your favorite economics book or Latin American studies book, and they'll tell you that the Alliance for Progress created an economic miracle. Well, you know, from a certain point of view, it did. Gross national product went up all through Central America. So did malnutrition. You know. And the reason is obvious. You drive people off the land, up into the hills, and you take over their land, and you produce beef for export and fancy crops. It's good for the gross national product. Just means the people starve. You know? And in fact, the crisis of the 1980s is largely caused by that plague. Well, let's just take the 1980s. During the 1980s, the Reagan administration is responsible for roughly 200,000 people slaughtered. And that doesn't mean just killed. You know, that means tortured and mutilated and raped. I mean, Pol Pot-style torture. That's pretty serious business. Hundreds of thousands, in fact millions of refugees, large areas of the country destroyed. All of this in an effort to block social reform in all three major countries where we were involved, in Honduras and El Salvador and Nicaragua. Now that's serious. What should we do? Well, the first thing we should do is stop torturing them. The second thing we should do is pay reparations because we owe them. After that, maybe there's some hope that they could reconstruct from the damage we've done to them. I think that's what we ought to do. Try to find anybody suggesting that in the mainstream, however. You can't express this view, not because it's false, but because it's true. And if you look into it, you'll find that it's true, I think. Now, what should we do? I mean, let's go back. Well, what we should do, I mean, we are free to act. Plenty of things that we can do. And for one thing, we can just provide aid ourselves. You don't have to wait for the state to order you to provide aid. They need it badly. I mean, Nicaragua's reeling. The hurricane last October was the final blow. They're going to have mass starvation there. Now, the government, of course, is delighted. The U.S. government, they won't send them a penny because they want them to suffer as much as possible. But American citizens are much more independent. And in fact, they've raised a lot of money. For example, there's one small Jesuit center in North Carolina or Virginia or somewhere, the Quest for Peace, it's called, the Quixote Center, I think they may have 3 staff members or something. They've raised millions of dollars from people in the United States who are able to think for themselves, who aren't just slaves of power. And those are things that can be done. You can help people survive. And you can, after all, put pressure on Congress, on the media, to do something about this. A lot of ways of doing that. All sorts of ways, ranging from civil disobedience to writing letters to the editor to, a mass popular organization. They're not going to put you in jail for it. In that sense, it's a very free country, which means if you don't do it, you have a lot more responsibility than if you don't do it in a place where you are afraid that you're going to be repressed. So there's no shortage of things to do. It's just a matter of willingness to do them. And the willingness to do them begins with a willingness to recognize reality. That's the hardest part. I think once you recognize reality, you won't have any more questions about what to do, because it's too obvious. So the first thing to do is to recognize the reality. That takes a little work. But once you recognize it, I think it's obvious what to do.
Another category in the article in the Progressive is passive phrases glossed over euphemisms. Shows how, for instance, New York Times said that Salvador Allende's policies in the 1972-73 era, before the coup in Chile, Allende's policies caused chaos, which brought in the military, kind of obscuring the fact that there's a U.S. government, particularly the CIA, and U.S. corporations like IT&T, which fomented the chaos in the first place. And the notion that the chaos prompted the military of the Chilean government to move in and restore order really was rather downplays and neutralizes the American role, and also the brutality of the coup, in which people later, tens of thousands, were jailed, tortured, disappeared, and just plain killed. Well, in Turkey, Turkey has had an abysmal record on civil rights. They've tortured people, murdered people, incarcerated trade unionists, and it's been horrible in Turkey. But the Washington Post said that they call these controversial measures. And Turkey's military despot pursued a, quote, down-to-earth approach as he sought to deal with the rough and tumble of everyday politics. Rough and tumble. Murder and torture, rough and tumble. Well, the Miami Herald had an article, too, that they mentioned in this category. It was headlined, Chemophobia may be as bad as chemicals, saying that the people who are trying to fight the chemicals that are in our food and in the air are really bad, because being afraid of those good chemicals is really harmful. The woman who wrote it said that the best scientific estimates, which she didn't specify, say that 99.9% of carcinogens in the diet come from natural sources, which she didn't identify. She said that synthetic chemicals account for only 0.01% of the carcinogens which the Americans consume. None of this had any identification or source for any of these assertions.
There's been quite a bit of this talk about so-called chemophobia.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is the corporations are pushing this big. The other thing that the big polluters are doing, who are producing chemicals and wastes and different things that are pesticides that are poisoning the environment and our food, they're producing these PBS nature shows for their penance for their crime. And FAIR, in their latest edition of Extra, their newsletter, has a list of the biggest chemical polluters in the world and their crimes and the penance. That is the PBS series that they fund. So BASF, that's one of Europe's most energetic toxic dumpers, it funds the PBS program Adventure. Chevron, which is California's largest petrochemical polluter, funds the PBS program National Geographic Special. DuPont, the major chemical polluter, the world's largest producer of ozone-eating chemicals, produces discoveries underwater. Georgia Pacific, which is a clear-cut timber and paper mill polluter, produces Forever Wild about the environment, and on and on and on through the biggest polluters, their crimes, and the whole series of PBS nature programs that they produce. that very rarely talk about pollution and some of the problems of these corporations destroying the environment. So this is the way they buy protection, by controlling the PBS programs about nature and the wilderness and making sure that their crimes are not investigated.
When I graduate, I'm going to be a history teacher.
History teacher.
What do you suggest in the high school? What do you suggest I do in that context to keep from perpetuating?
Well, you know, that's really important. I mean, you know, a lot of people, I suspect many of you, if you think of your own experience, I know me, you can remember cases where a teacher really made a terrific impression on you. I mean, most schooling is just training for stupidity and conformity. But every once in a while, and that's institutional too, there are reasons for that. But occasionally, you know, you get a spark. Somebody will challenge your mind, you know, make you think, encourage you to think, and so on. And that's a tremendous effect. You know, you just reach all sorts of people. Of course, if you do it, you're going to be, you may very well have problems. You have to tread a narrow line. There are plenty of people who don't want students to think. They're afraid of the crisis of democracy. You know, people start thinking and you get all these problems I was quoting at the beginning. You know, they won't have humility enough to submit to a civil rule, you know, or they'll start trying to press their demands in the political arena, or they'll, you know, have ideas of their own instead of believing what they're told. And privilege and power typically doesn't want that, so they can react. And a high school teacher who tries to get students to think may find repression, firing, and so on.
You said a lot about the role of the media in a so-called democracy. I'm wondering how you see the role of our educational system, what it's doing right now, what forces are driving it, and what constraints are on it, and how should it operate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. You know, it means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, you know, like stupid assignments and things like that, you know that the only people who will make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, you know. So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class. And you want to make it, and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, you know. There are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, you know. Those people are called behavioral problems, or something like that. They end up in the principal's office or in the streets or selling drugs or whatever. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And I don't know how to prove this, but I have a feeling that when you go to the elite universities, you find more obedience and conformity. Probably because you're getting the students who were better able to do it. You know? Well, all of that is functional. That's the way it works. But it works right through graduate school. I mean, by the time you get to graduate school, it's already a little more varied because some real contradictions develop in the system. The problem is that you can't have progress this way. You know, now, especially in the sciences and engineering, that's a problem because the corporations need science and engineering. You know, if you don't have innovation, you're really in trouble. So they have to encourage creativity and independence because you can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, you know, and thinking new thoughts and so on. And there you got a real contradiction. It's hard to train people to be creative and challenging and so on, and yet to ensure that somewhere else in their lives they're conformist and obedient and never think. So you have problems. It's a serious problem in Japan, incidentally. We think of Japan as this tremendous superpower, but that's very misleading. Japan, for example, is very poor in science, for example, and they're aware of it. And part of the reason is it's part of the same thing that makes them good workers, obedient workers. It's a very obedient society, very deferential and conformist society. And one effect of that is that there are real constraints against independent, free thinking, and you see it in the sciences very clearly. But it's a problem here too. So there are those contradictions, and when you get to graduate school, they're beginning to show up. They show up much less in the ideological subjects, because there it doesn't matter so much if people have, profits aren't made by historians having original ideas about the French Revolution, so they can have conventional ideas. And that means that the pressure to try to support innovation and freedom is much less, and the pressures for conformity, on the other hand, are much greater, because in the ideological subjects it begins to be dangerous if people think the wrong thoughts. It's not so dangerous if they have new ideas about physics. But nevertheless, you begin to get a little flux in the system by the time you get to graduate school. And even at lower levels, you find it. I mean, there are teachers who do stimulate thought, and sometimes they get away with it. And all the way through, if people are learning things, you just can't control. You can't make them just regurgitate what they heard. Now, there's a lot of pressure to turn the schools into the Marine Corps, and there's a lot of support for it. For example, there's this bestseller last couple of years by Alan Bloom. That was all over the supermarkets, Closing of the American Mind, which huge bestseller, supermarket racks, which is where I read it, and things like that. Well, you take a look at what he's saying, and there was plenty, a lot of enthusiastic accolades for it and so on. He was saying that a couple of us smart guys will decide what the great thoughts are, and every student will memorize them, and that's education. Okay. Well, that's a way to turn people into pure automata. I mean, even if they happen to pick the great thoughts, there is no way less likely to get anybody to think about those thoughts than to make that the curriculum. That finishes them off, and I think that's the purpose, really. I mean, the purpose is just to impose authority, Here's the great thoughts. All this other stuff is rubbish. Just learn those and you're okay. I'll pick them, you memorize them. That's basically the line. Now, of course, that's the opposite of education. I mean, that's the way you study Talmud or something like that. But it's very popular, and I think it reflects the same concern over the crisis of democracy. In fact, Bloom himself was extremely... The incident that really got to him was a case in Cornell, where he was a professor, where some black students took over one of the buildings. And he said that's just like the Nazis, it's back to the Nazis. He has a whole business about the Nazis and so on and so forth. Well, you take a look at what happened in that. He doesn't tell you what he thought and he says the faculty capitulated, just like Heidegger capitulated to the Nazis and so on. What actually happened, if you look back, is that there were real grievances. Undoubtedly, the students shouldn't have done what they did and go into the building with guns and so on, but it was settled very amicably. It was settled amicably. Nobody was killed. The grievances were to some extent dealt with, and the net result was better than it was before. Well, he didn't tell you what he thought they should have done, but it's sort of implicit. I mean, I guess they should have bombed the place or something like that. But that's what really set him off. And in general, what set many people off was the 60s are now described in the literature as if it was a time when students were running around burning libraries and destroying the foundations of civilization and so on. What was actually going on is they were asking questions. They were raising questions. They were looking into things that people hadn't looked into before. They were not just obedient. And from the point of view of a lot of the faculty, that's equivalent to burning the buildings. You can't, that small distinction, you can't make that. There's pressure to turn the schools back to the days when you didn't have to worry about those things, like disobedient students asking questions about things that you didn't tell them to think about and so on.
The last category of media con game article in the Progressive by Martin Lee and Norman Solomon is the numbers racket. Of course, any of you have been in demonstrations have seen this before, where the media will say, oh, if it's somebody they don't like, then, well, it'll just be a small number, and the cops will always underestimate what the organizers and other people who participated in a particular thing say really happened. For instance, there was a story, the New York Times said 15,000 Jews and Palestinians join Jerusalem peace rally. people who saw the peace rally and who were there said there had to be at least 35,000. The organization Peace Now said this also. Another way they distort, during the mid-'80s, the State Department always kept saying, and the media always just dutifully repeated their quotes, that there were between 2,500 and 3,500 Cubans in Nicaragua as military personnel, and they eventually upped that up to 3,500 to 5,000 Cubans in Nicaragua. Well, when Rafael del Pino Diaz defected to the United States in 1987, he said, no, there have only been 300 to 400 Cubans in Nicaragua, and that was the number which the Cubans and the Nicaraguans had been saying all along. A more significant way of media distortion in this numbers racket category is when they start talking about unemployment, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases these figures, which you hear repeatedly all the time on the news, but they really hide the true extent of unemployment. For instance, not counted are people without jobs who haven't looked for a job in over a month because the prospects are discouraging. And they're also, they don't count in it people who retire early. They don't, they count in the people as being employed who only worked 1 day a week. Now, you can't hardly live on that, but nonetheless, that counts as somebody who's employed. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually puts out another report called the U7 rate, which factors in all these other things we just mentioned, the discouraged employment, the early retirees. So it's a much considerably greater, more accurate figure than the one you get on the regular media. So in 1986, when the media reported the average national unemployment rate was 6.2%, the U7 rate, which the journalists ignore, was 14.3%. And that was much more accurate. But of course, that would have everybody all up in the air and excited, and they don't want to do that in this country. They've got to keep the people cool. So what's the worth of all the news you get from the media, particularly on television? A British journalist named Ed Harriman says, despite the wonders of communications technology, the news often seems little more than folklore, a steady stream of nursery tales for adults.
And that's the end of this Alternative Views. I'd like to thank Lori Lackland, Melissa Crowley, and Michael Ferris for their editing assistance on this program. Also, Paul Lukowski and Jim Dickerson, who provided the tape with a speech of Noam Chomsky from Eau Claire, Wisconsin.